it has been really enriching, and I'm not yet in the closing panel. I want to turn to two of our speakers in the last session and to ask them to make sense of all what we have heard, to come out with some insights of how much the very impressive set of comments and knowledge and issues that all of the panelists have brought this afternoon can really put together to produce better policies. As Secretary General Gurria mentioned, that's the quest of the OECD, produce better policies for better lives. And the reflection that we had with the Open Market Institute and with Barry, of course, this is not a discussion that happens just because we are interested in these issues. This happens because we are confronted with a major shock, the most important shock in our lifetimes, that made us realize how fragile our systems are, how vulnerable, how unable we were to identify those vulnerabilities. And we moved from systems to systems on the health side, on the vaccine, on the market for vaccines, on the question of the financial markets, on the question of the supply chains that you have underscored in several of the panels, on the question of the political economy, and even on the question of competition policies that we have as one of the most elaborated set of guidance that our governments have. But at the end, if we have a Congress person, a very prominent Congress person who is chairing the Antitrust Commission, asking us to have a moratorium on mergers and acquisitions, and actually he just tweeted that he made this comment here in our joint seminar with NAEC and the Open Market Institute. I think that we need to rethink, as all of our speakers have mentioned, the kind of analytical frameworks, tools, and definitions in our economic policy toolkit to produce better outcomes. And we are convinced that the systems thinking can provide a lot of insights, but we need to translate that into something practical, something actionable, and something that helps us to be better prepared, because if something is certain is that we are going to have several other shocks. Just last year, as I told you, we have this conference on preventing systemic collapse of NAEC, and we are very sorry to have been right. Now let me turn to our commentators, and we benefit from the presence of Pascal Lamy. Thank you, Pascal. You were the first to connect, along with also Laurence Boone, who's going to join you. I don't think he needs any presentation, but of course he has been at the core of developing the systems as we're having, and he has been also at the core of trying to advance better solutions for the international economy as a former European Commissioner, and also as a former DG of the World Trade Organization, and now as chairman of the Paris Peace Forum. I'm in his steering committee, so he's also my boss on that ground. And on Laurence Boone, who is our chief economist, I think Laurence has been helping the world to understand the impact of the health crisis on the economy. But she was also the economic advisor of President Hollande and Sherpa to the G20, and also the chief economist of AXA. So the question is very straightforward, Pascal and Laurence. And Paul, I think you also are going to be chipping in. I don't know if you moved to the previous panel or if you are also going to comment on this one, but you have been introduced and we have benefited from your insights. So the question is very straightforward. What do we do about it? What do we do, what you have heard? How do we ensure that we use this system thinking to produce better outcomes? How do we get out of this crisis? And then how do we build more resilient systems as we have been proposing in NAEC? And the floor is yours. We start with Pascal, we go with Laurence, and then we go with Paul.
Okay, thanks, Gabriela. Good to see you all. Even if I'd like to kiss many of you I see, sorry, not doable, so virtual kiss and handshake for the others. I've been listening to this conversation from the very beginning. I found it extremely rich. If there is, I think, one consensus stemming from this morning's discussion, it is that global capitalism will have to be rebalanced, and that the pre-COVID balance between efficiency and resilience will have to tilt on the side of resilience. That's, I think, a sort of global conclusion of what has been said. This, of course, has major systemic consequences. And my point would be that I can see how this can be done relatively easily and quickly at firm level or at national level. After all, it's a question of risk repricing. And we can have military equipment which is more resilient than ordinary equipment, provided we pay for that. So if it's within a firm, this rebalancing would lead to a repricing of risk and to costs, which then will have to be somehow either absorbed by productivity or by profit or by the consumer. Rather easy in theoretical terms. The point I'd like to make very briefly is that this rebalancing, which is easy at the sort of firm or national level, will be much more difficult to do at global level. And the reason for that is that leveling the playing field in efficiency is much easier than leveling the playing field in resilience. And the reason for that is very simple. Efficiency in a global market capitalism is ideologically flat. It's about profit maximization under some public constraints. Leveling the playing field in precaution is much more difficult because precaution is a much more heterogeneous domain. It is heavily influenced by ideology, by culture, by religion, simply because a risk is something in between a pole of good and a pole of bad. And the pole of good and the pole of bad are heavily dependent on mental representations, what anthropologists call cognitive differences, to use a bit of a technical word. This is going to be a big problem. And that's my answer to Sharon, who was teasing me a few hours ago on whether I would still look as much to fight against protectionism. Of course I would, because I think opening trade is the way to go under some conditions. The problem being that dealing with what I call precautionism will be much tougher than dealing with protectionism. Protecting producers from foreign competition is a cooking we understand, we know the technicalities of this, we know the politics of that. Protecting people from risks in a different way will fragment the global trading system in a much more definitive fashion than tariffs. And I will, and of course, as a consequence of that, the debalancing of the level playing field, or the bigger difficulty to level it, will harm small countries, small producers, and poorer people, even in rich countries more. And I will take to conclude just one example with one proposal to sort of land this theoretical discussion into reality. We are talking a lot about medical stuff, medicines, drugs, medical equipment. If you want to increase human welfare, you have to decrease the price of medical stuff. If you look at the global system today, the problem with the price of medical stuff, optimizing efficiency and resilience in medical stuff, is not tariffs. The trade problem with medical stuff is not tariff, it's non-tariff measures. And in this case, a perfectly understandable precaution, which translates into drugs marketing authorizations. It's absolutely logical that before I admit a drug on my market, I check that they are good for human health. The problem being that in this field, the procedures from different countries, the criteria, the certification, what you have to test, what you have to demonstrate, the sort of guarantees you have to have are totally different. If we want to reach more efficiencies and more resilience in this business, the solution is very simple. You have to level the playing field in terms of precaution, i.e., make sure that there is a minimum and, if possible, a maximum of convergence, of harmonization of the way you do that. This leads to one of the questions that was raised. Can the present system do that? No. The WTO has no authority, nor does it have any expertise to say, look, guys, we are going to harmonize marketing drugs authorization systems. It has to be done at another level, probably somewhere between WTO and WHO, a bit like what exists in the Codex Alimentarius between WHO and FAO. I'm taking this example because these systemic issues have to land somewhere, and this is one of the issues and proposals which I think we have to look in this direction.
Thank you, Pascal. True that the standardization and the change of the regimes that we have in terms of medicines would need to be rethought completely. The question of the cost of this movement to make the systems more resilient related to your argument of leveling the playing field, I think we really need to get into this debate, because the fact is I feel the train has gone on that direction. I feel that now what we're hearing from policymakers is how do we shorten supply chains, how we are less dependent from foreign producers, and how do we build up the buffers ourselves away from the system of just in time. And so, Laurence, how do we reconcile what Pascal is saying, that we try to preserve the benefits of the whole construction that we have built from free trade and eliminating these tariffs, but at the same time, we know that the sentiment, that the vulnerability that he has created is bringing policymakers to look inward, not outward.
Thanks, Gabriela, and thanks everybody. So I listened to most, also not all of it, but it was super interesting. And I think this conference really matches the questions that we're all trying to analyze at the OECD. And Pascal really put a name on it, which is that resilience comes with a price, whereas I think we have a huge problem with the price discovery of the real value of some things. But anyway, I will try and focus on a few points. The first thing is just to sum up what we knew, and in order to try and see how we can, what we knew, what got worse with the crisis, and what's really new, and see how we can get from there. Because as you were saying, Gabriela, I think NAEC in particular and the OECD more generally, as well as the people around the table, so to speak, have been warning about this situation many times. So I think we sort of knew that we were not prepared for risks which have a low probability but have huge implication. And that's true for the pandemic. It's also true for climate. And I think it's also true for cyber security. And as Dawn was highlighting, energy. And also I think what became even more apparent was that we lacked flexibility and agility in our response. We also knew that we had interconnected societies, both advanced and less advanced, and the fact that the virus spreads through plane, as somebody reminded us at the beginning, is really highlighting that. And then, as Pascal was mentioning, we also knew that the global governance had become fragile. Now, what seems to be accentuated is, I think, something that really has to do with resilience and that Sharon was alluding to, which is the question of inequality between people. And this crisis really point the finger at it, having spared those who can telework like us and the others who are on the front line. What's more new, I think, is the anxiety about the security of our health system and the security of the supply chain, and we had ample discussion in the previous session, and about the stability of our economies and society, which also has to do with the inequalities I was mentioning. And also, I think we've put an infinite price on the value of life in this crisis, which is something that we were not really mentioning as well or as clearly before. And so that's roughly what we knew and what became a bit novel. And the question is, how do we answer this to ensure, and I think that's implicit in all the work of NAEC and INET, ensure economic and social resilience, because one doesn't go without the others. So you were asking, how do we do it? Which I think is the most difficult question, for which we don't have a definite answer, but let me offer a few directions. I think at the national level, we all have, risks agency, and they usually have to draw back. One is they tend to focus on one type of risks. And the other is that they tend to be within government and with little participation of other actors like firms, civil society was mentioned several times, and non-governmental organizations. They tend to treat each risk in silo, and they probably don't pay enough attention towards interconnection. And I also think that there is an issue of communication. Otherwise, people would put more pressure, so we don't hear them loud enough. But that's perhaps because of the institutional setup, and I'd be curious to know how many of them are actually accountable to parliaments. The other thing is, now let me move. So the lesson I would take from this is it has to be across ministries, and it has to involve a lot more participants of the society, whether it's the civil society, whether it's firms, whether it's NGO, and it has to be embedded in a process that gives democratic control over what they do in order to put pressure. And I think there was a lot of discussion before that, we needed to empower, people needed to be responsible and to put pressure for these issues. And then you raise the issue of the global organization and governance. And it's, I think, very striking that we don't have some sort of agency that covers all those risks, the natural risk, like obviously the pandemic risk, but also the climate risk, also the cybersecurity risk, and all of those that actually are intertwined and have impact on each other. And that for this sort of agency, and it can be a network of already existing institutions, obviously, but they would need obviously funding, they would need a capacity to issue principles and standards like the OECD does. The OECD does, they would be in charge of coordinating research and solution. And I think one model, but which again is exclusively focused on one risk and which is the financial risk, is the Financial Stability Board. But really all the natural risks we have discussed and their interconnection with the real and financial economy should make them really a common concern for one institution or group of institutions. And by the way, I would just like to remind, as you know, as all of you know, actually the Financial Stability Board was set up in the wake of the great financial crisis. So perhaps we have to think about something like that. Then I would like to make just a final point, being mindful of time. It's the discussion on supply chain and the lack of transparency was very striking to me. And there's an area we keep doing, if I use the analogy with the financial system, like for the FSB, we have stress tests for the banking sector. And in a way, we also have stress tests for the insurance sector. Believe me, there's nothing more intransparent than a solvency model or the model of assessing the risk of an insurer balance sheet. But yet we manage to do this. And I was wondering to what extent it would be feasible to actually ask firms, whether they're private or public, to consider stress testing their supply chain in the same spirit that we stress test banks' balance sheet or insurer balance sheets. And we could stress test them for the closing down of one country or another. I'm pretty much convinced that most businesses are doing it, but it's not being made public to any regulator. And that may be a road to have actually more insight on the supply chain and also understanding better where they go and where the risks are. The very last point I would like to make is we had a lot of discussion about competition and resilience and how, competition had led the production to be really dependent on one country or a couple of countries, depending on the supply chain. There are two roads from there. One is to shorten the supply chain and imagine that you can put everything back onto your territory. And we heard the congressman really thinking about this. And there is another one, which is ensuring diversification. And diversification requires a level playing field in competition and resilience. But I think we should consider it much more than shortening the supply chain, because there's one element which we haven't much discussed this afternoon, which is this, becoming more national and shortening the supply chain will raise tremendous issue for the south part of the world. And the last thing we want to do, I think, when we strengthen the resilience of our system, is actually widen the divergence and the inequality between the north and the south. So that's a few points to try and contribute or sum up some of the points of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurence, and we wish we had more time, because you have really touched upon very concrete institutional innovations that could be brought to bear in terms of bringing this new thinking. Paul, we are late. We will give you the floor for your final remarks, and then I will conclude this panel and pass the word to Barry. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much. I'll be very quick. First of all, nice to see and speak with Laurence and Pascal, who are good friends. A few points very quickly, each of them. First of all, the way we've used efficiency this afternoon, this is the efficiency in the minds of businessmen and women, not efficiency in the minds of economists. The not coping for resilience is a market failure. And I think this matters in terms of both the debate and not walking into a roadblock when the three speakers on this panel, our friends at the top universities, weigh in and say we don't understand the concepts. But it's also important to recruit them to greater resilience. Inadequate resilience is market failure. This is not something to do with neoliberalism or views of social welfare functions. That's the first thing. Second thing I'd say is Laurence made, I think it's a great, really important point, a great point about the infinite price being put on life. And I think the reason for that is, for what it's worth, is that I think as citizens, we will tolerate a probability of dying from the flu or cancer even, God help us, if we think that our societies have done their best, given the currently available technology, to prepare for that particular kind of problem and make it available to everybody. Whereas this is something that no one is prepared for at all. And so if people have pursued herd immunity, as some governments may have contemplated for a while, what it's amounted to saying is we're not going to protect you actually. We're going to let you die. So I think the reason I'm saying that is I think a lot of the literature, particularly in law schools, about the value of life and the cost-benefit world is pretty misconceived, because it actually only works when you know the underlying stochastic process, or have got an estimate of the underlying stochastic process. It's not helpful when you confront something which you don't understand. Now, that brings me to a point. It matters enormously how exposed we are to pandemic risk. I mean, the appropriate response depends, rather like the banking crisis. It matters whether this is a 1 in 700 year event, or actually whether we could have another one of these in 5 years' time. And what is specially different about this kind of crisis from the financial stability crisis in 07-08 is that although the 07-08 crisis was dreadful, and although my world hadn't covered itself in glory, as it was happening, actually, we had the tools to understand it. Whereas the scientists and the medics involved with this, they don't understand this virus even now. And so it's very hard for them to give robust advice. Economists put uncertainty bands around things. The uncertainty bands for them, it seems that they don't talk very much on uncertainty, but the uncertainty bands for them must be enormous. I would make 2 more points and then stop. First of all, about stress testing. I think this has been a fantastic development in the banking field, probably the most important development in the last 30 or 40 years, sadly, most of which I can remember. But don't underestimate the extent to which not only the industry have been trying to undermine it, which is definitely the case, but also it's being complained, it's opaque. For the rule of law, it needs to be much more formulaic. And so actually, it has become bureaucratized. I mean, I was one of the high priests of stress testing in 2010-11, and I tell you, they're not doing it in the way that I would want them to do it, because they need to justify their process as fair. And so the trade-offs we face aren't just between resilience and business efficiency. They're also, how do you ensure due process without bogging yourself down in a process that actually removes the value? The final thing I would say is about international organizations and the international system, where I basically agree with what others have said. But the key thing, Laurence mentioned the Financial Stability Board. And the Financial Stability Board, I think, was terrific, although everyone has to accept that I would say that. The key things about the Financial Stability Board are, A, it was built on the Financial Stability Forum. And in truth, although finance ministries were involved, it was hosted by the Bank for International Settlements, and at least initially driven by central banks who could not be closer to each other as a community. And I think the big question in the health field is, and I wouldn't push it now if I were in office, is the WHO fit for being built into a different kind of organization or not? And what other kinds of organization are needed in other fields? And how does one build one that's effective through a community that already exists? It's very hard to build effective organizations. I would have more faith in an add-on to the OECD than something that came out of the blue as a new concept.
Okay, we are going to finish with that fantastic statement, Paul. Just to say, I'm going to pass the floor now to Barry because we are over time. But I just want to say that this has been the best investment we have made to listen to you and also to bring all the speakers. What we take from here is that what we have been proposing in NAEC to go for systems thinking, to make sure that the efficiency argument is just one option, is not the only option, because it has been presented by all the economic policy frameworks as the main option, and following from that, all the other things, equity, distribution, or resilience will follow, but it's just one. And we need to understand that there are trade-offs and there are policy choices. And I think this is exactly what we have learned all day long. And I'm sure that we, with collaboration with Barry, will continue discussing these options, because we cannot have all the answers. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but these kind of reflections will probably help us to be less vulnerable if the next crisis come. So Barry, the floor is yours. Thank you so much to my speakers.
Yeah. Thank you, Gabriela. It's been a truly excellent collaboration with the entire NAEC team and the OECD. And I just want to thank a couple of people as we reach the end of the day. You know, William Hines and Julian Karaguzian were just worked fantastically hard on this, and it's, you know, we look forward very much to this continuing. I also wanted to thank a couple of the other folks, Angela Stewart at the OECD, and also Nidhi Hegde and Kat Dill with our team, and actually the whole open markets team. It's as you mentioned, this is the beginning of a collaboration. It started last year at that fantastic conference that you guys held last September on averting systemic collapse, as you mentioned, as you noted. The collapse came perhaps a lot sooner than we expected, but you know, it's great when a conversation is already underway. That helps you understand what happened and what to do about it. This is the beginning of a conversation. We, as the Open Markets, looks forward very much to continuing this, and it's a great honor to be able to work with you all. And I do want to, I believe that the Secretary General Gurria is available, and I just wanted to flip it back to him for one last comment.
Thank you, Barry. Listen, in any seminar, in Davos, you know, in any, the greatest thing, the greatest ambition is you don't have to be thinking what you're going to say in order to sound reasonably intelligent. You just listen to the wisdom. You just sit there and choose which are the people you're going to hear, etc. And today was one of those days, you know. Actually, Gabriela said, would you like to participate? And I said, no, absolutely no way. I would just like to listen. And it has been so rewarding. As I said before, our duty, our motto is actually better policies for better lives. But how can we tell our member countries and our partner countries, which now add to more than 100, not just the 36 members, now about 38, by the way, we're growing. But how do we tell them what it is that they have to do if we ourselves are not aware, at least, of the cutting edge of what's going on, and what are the ideas? What are the new things that are going on? You provide us with that. You know, you give us that oomph. You know, that you give us that push, and you also give us that ambition. You give us a vision, and then our mission becomes, if not easier, because it's never easy, but at least it becomes clearer. We have a greater sense of purpose. So you provide all that. That's invaluable. And I'd just like to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Again, it's been terrific working with you guys, and it's a fantastic organization. And I want to, you know, it's terrific that the folks 70 years ago created organizations that we can use today. And it's important to have institutions. And OECD is one of the foundations of this world, and will continue to be.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. To the next one.